this is joint work with Danny Harari, who is now a postdoc here, and Nimrod Dorfman, who is finishing his PhD in a month or two, and a former student, Diony. Now, in vision, we do much more than object recognition. We can look at complicated scenes like this, for example, and we understand what's going on in this scene. We know what happened before. We know why the people are probably up there on the power line and so on. So eventually we want vision to get us to understand. Okay, is that okay? Can you hear me? So we talked a lot about object recognition and invariances in object recognition, but this is a part of the problem. Just a few more things that we would like to do quickly and naturally from vision is to not just get a general object label, but to get a complete interpretation of the scene as complete as possible. And here I'm labeling only some of the things that we can infer as well. But in general, you can point to a pixel and we know what the pixel belongs to, what it represents at a local level, parts and subparts and various other parts of the scene. Action recognition is very difficult and quite different from object recognition, so we want to be able to say what these people are doing. And although the images are very, very diverse and different, very difficult to train and find similar images in the future, but we know that all of these people are engaged in the process of drinking, and even some complicated drinking. We understand what these things are. So vision has to tackle and deal with problems like this as well. Agents interaction is something that we do very naturally, and it starts very early on in development. So we can know how these people interact, and we understand that this is sort of a hugging situation. This is confrontation or disagreement. We know the type of interaction that, as I said, all of these are, say, hugging, but we know something about the tone, that these types of hugs are different from these. These are sort of cordial politician hugs, and these are intimate hugs, and we get this in an instant. The people have done some psychophysics on this. We do this about at the same time that it needs to just recognize simple objects. So we take these things out very quickly. So these are the kind of things that we eventually would like to be able to do and recognize and interpret and take out of the scene. But what I like to do today is to describe some modeling that we have done that relates to the question of sort of how it all starts. So it starts with sort of, at least if you think about human cognition, it starts with a baby that looks at pixels, sort of changing pixels. And initially, these are just points of light, but after watching sufficient number of those, little by little, the images start to acquire meaning. Now, they acquire meaning not only through vision alone, but vision is a very powerful route towards acquiring meaning, and much of it can come through continuous watching. Babies also eventually start to manipulate things and so on, but and they have other modalities besides vision. But vision is certainly a major route towards acquiring meaning from just a lot of watching a lot of data. And this is something that we'd like eventually to understand and to be able to model and to mimic, to have streams of images and from them require meaning without explicit or detailed specific world knowledge, watch many movies, and eventually develop representations of various concepts that will allow us to understand, to get visual understanding of the type that I illustrated briefly in the previous slide. So this, starting with this initial, how it all starts, has to do with sort of Lorenzo's box of what you have to put in, what's inside, that allows you to then quickly, from a relatively small number of supervised examples, acquire world knowledge. So this is sort of belongs to here. And I will speak briefly about two, maybe 2.5 things. One is how we start with, as I said, relatively nothing, and manage to, from just watching many movies, acquire the concept of hands and the concept and use of direction of gaze following. As you will see, both are very difficult concepts. Both are interesting, and we selected them in part because they appear very early in child development. It's two of the very earliest concepts that babies acquire from looking at images, and are all not just isolated concepts, but are important for subsequent learning about actions, about goals, about interactions between people, even about language, as I mentioned. So there are sort of milestones or important concepts on the way to acquire meaning of the scene you watch. So let me start with talk a little bit about acquiring the concept of hands. Hands are very important for for recognition, for example, of actions, recognizing actions, recognizing interactions. You'd like to know where the hands are and what they're doing. On the other hand, turns out that for strict computer vision, finding hands in images can be very, very challenging. And there are two reasons why hands are so difficult compared to other objects. First, hands are very variable because they are flexible, very flexible, so you can have very many appearances of the object hand. And secondly, in many images, they can be, just because of their size and because of what they're doing, they can be very often partly occluded, not seen very well. So in these images, we know exactly where the hands are, but the hand, we know, everybody sees that it's a person holding a camera, but this is the image of the holding a camera. It's not very detailed, it's not very easy to recognize out of context. Not surprisingly then, that if you look at some standard ways of trying to find objects of interest in the scene, in models of visual saliency, there are models that let you look at an image and define locations or find locations that are supposed to be the most interesting in the scenes, partly for the purpose of computer vision. People are also trying to model how people select points of interest in the scene. And if you look at static scenes without motion, then hands are not typically the things that comes up early on in this model. If you try in some unsupervised ways to just look at many images and hope that the concept of hands will come up in one of the hidden layers of the big network or something like this, this is something that we use some modeling of recognition that we have done, which automatically select the most informative image fragments in images. So here we gave the system many images of people as opposed to scenes without people, and the task of the learning system was then to discover the most informative subpatches that distinguish the people, the images with people and without, and hands do not come out almost at all as informative patches in this situation. We tried our own version of deep learning, and this was a couple of years ago, so maybe deep learning today can do more, but this deep learning system saw lots and lots of images of people and non-people, and we couldn't find any internal nodes that became specifically tuned to hands. So perhaps not surprising, this is a quote from some years ago, but some people who have done a lot of recognition work, and they describe the problem of discovering body parts and hands included in those, as they say, arguably the most difficult recognition problem in computer vision. You can argue with this, arguably, maybe not, but they are certainly at the top of the list, are very difficult. Now, in contrast, it's interesting that for babies, it's immediate and it's early. Babies look at hands all the time. They look at faces and hands, and even if the hands are small and partly occluded and stationary, when they look around, they look at faces and they look at hands all the time. There are experiments now. People started to put small cameras on infants. This is maybe a slightly older infant, a toddler or something, but they're doing it for very, very young infants. And it turns out that from the beginning, when you look at what they see, what they are looking at, there are hands there all the time. Primarily hands manipulating objects, but hands start to appear in all of these images. They also know things about, it's not just sort of the object recognition. They have some notion about what hands are doing, that hands are sort of the movers of things. For example, in an experiment that you can do with babies, they see a hand carrying an object just moving on the screen back and forth. And after adapting to this for a while, they see either just the hand moving or just the object moving. They are not surprised at all to see this, but they are very surprised to see this. So they know that in this joint motion, it's the hand carrying the object rather than the two moving independently and so on. So in looking the hands, it turns out it makes sense that the hands of motion, hands as moving thing, is very important. But as I mentioned, it's not just the motion of hands. It turns out that motion by itself, it's not a very powerful cue. If you look at videos and you focus on all the pixels that are moving, there are lots of them all the time. But hands are also specific type of motions. And in infant studies, it has also been shown that people from the first weeks you can test them are sensitive to subcategories of types of motion moving other things, things that stay stationary and suddenly start to move on their own. They make distinctions between these type of motions. And this, based on this, the route that we suggested and explored is that the cue that you have internally to distinguish and focus specifically on hands is the hands as having the property of a mover, something that moves and can move other things. And this starts to be detected and used not by doing any object recognition, we even do not assume any object, figure ground segmentation into regions. It's sort of a very simple built-in detector at the level of pixels. We are basically looking for moving pixels in the image that come in contact with other pixels and change them or move them carrying around. So it's just a computation on the optical flow. Technically, we divide the image into small cells, and we are looking into cells in which there is optical flow coming into the cell, getting out of the cell, and during this time or after this coming in and going out, this motion in and out, there is some change inside this cell. This is the way we just monitor pixels in the image. And whenever there is, at some pixel, this mover event detected, we grab an image, rectangular image surrounding this, this location. This is again following known behavior in which once there is a moving object, the tendency already of infants is to track it for a little while, for about 2 seconds or so. And this is what we get. We also get some non-hand mover frames, but they are the minority by the great majority of the frames which are acquired in this way automatically from just a collection of videos, which I'll show you in a minute, are specifically captured around hands. So you can see that, and this will be a repeating theme, you can see that certain simple events can supply internal supervision, in this case, internal supervision by movers and tracking. And this gets to the question that was posed at the very beginning of this entire symposium. How can you deal with the world in which you really need supervision all the time? In order to get hands, you need lots and lots of supervised examples, but nobody is supervising you. And here, a simple internal signal, the mover event and tracking supplies you with a very large amount of good specific data. It's not completely noise-free, but it's good collection of supervised data selected by this internal supervision. So we apply this, we collect the data from a bunch of videos, and the videos sometimes had people manipulating objects, sometimes just people walking around and so on. And when you do this, when you run the detection from movies that do not contain people manipulating objects, you get a very low yield of mover detection frames, but whenever there are people manipulating objects, then the thing gets excited and you get a large collection and you can use them now for recognition. For recognition, we use now, since we have lots and lots of labeled data, we use standard recognition. I'll show you in a minute what we used, but standard recognition used in computer vision, and this is not the best slide, but this is after the initial stage of using the movers to train hands. This is detection of hands in static images. So each is just a static frame. You run the detector and it finds hands with high precision. I'll show you in a minute. Now, the detection of hands continues in the model to be elaborated and become better as a result of two recognition algorithms that complement each other in, I think, in an interesting way. One is to detect hands by their appearance, and the other one is to detect hands by the surrounding body context. In this image, for example, It's very difficult to recognize the hands. You cannot see them here, but it's very difficult to recognize them. We know where they are by the surrounding body context around them. So for appearance, we use standard appearance-based models. In fact, we use our own version, which is called ANN star model, which has an advantage that it can deal with a large number of different appearances of the same object. And for dealing with this context-based recognition, which use sort of context coming from the face and from other body parts, we used another model that we had a few years before that does recognition of targets by the surrounding context. So this assumed to be sort of standard recognition models that need the supervision, and once it gets the internal supervision, they can do their thing. The context-based, I will not go into the detail of the model, but basically it looks at the collection of, it looks at the image and a collection of features in the image. You have to give it supervision, you give it a target. I want to recognize this hand, and then it finds sort of a surrounding context of chains of features which are leading from other features like the face towards the hand. And so during training, you have to train it in a supervised way, and then later on, even if it's occluded and very difficult to see what's there, the surrounding context will lead to the location of the target through the chains of features that you have identified through learning. These are some results of following training, how this algorithm works. So these two algorithms are interesting in the sense that, again, they supply interesting internal supervision that gives supervision and guides appearance. Appearance does the same to pose, because think that initially you have some detection of a mover event and you recognize the pose and a particular appearance. Later on, you can use the pose. Now, if the appearance completely changed, but still the pose will tell you that this is a hand, and you grab the new appearance. Now you can move the appearance to a new location, you recognize the appearance, and this guides you to acquire a new pose. And these two things sort of co-supervise each other internally, and they make the detection better and better quite quickly. What we see here is the improvement of the detection through iterations of this co-supervision of appearance and context. This is the initial recognition, precision recall detection. You see that it's not very good, but in fact it's not bad. What happens here is that you get high precision detection of hands, but low recall, because initially you just recognize hands in a particular appearance, in a particular instance of manipulating, grabbing an object, and you do not recognize hands in general, hence the low recall. But doing this co-supervision of appearance and pose, it quickly gets up, and in fact, after 3 iterations and from a couple of videos, it gets to a good recall precision, which can be compared with fully supervised situation in which you go frame by frame and you give an accurate annotation of where the hand is. So this is what you can get from the fully annotated situation. This is what the green one is, what you get automatically for just watching the movies and using your own internally supplied supervision. Another possible conceivable source of internal source of learning and labeling to guide the learning of hands could in principle come from your own hands. You can think about a baby or an agent moving their own hands around, watching them, and in this way acquiring labeled data that these are hands. We do not think that this is what's happening. We tried to do this and to mimic and to learn hand from this. And what you get is the green kind of performance. This is for manipulating hand. This is for non-manipulating hand. The results in general are much poorer, in particular in the case that babies start with and start looking at, the difference is very, very large. So although we think that your own hands is an interesting category, we believe that eventually infants learn it as another interesting category, subcategory of hands. We do not think that in this case, this is the main avenue through which hands are acquired. So far for hands, and let me be a bit quicker in talking about gaze. Gaze is another interesting early concept, visual concept that infants acquire. They know where other people are looking at, and they sort of naturally follow it, and that's interesting to watch in videos of infants. So they look at their caregiver, their parents, and so on, and if the parents is looking at somewhere, an object over there, they will follow the gaze and look at the same object that the other person is looking at. And this is an important tendency, important capacity I will mention later on. It's really helpful in understanding the goals of other people, interactions, and even acquisition of language, getting the reference of nouns and verbs. So we do it very well, and for us, it's something that we sort of focus on. It's instantly we notice what the person is looking at. Depending on where you're sitting, you can probably tell that this person is sort of looking at you rather than looking at the objects down here. But the gaze, for the eyes in this case, are not highly informative. They are not that obvious feature, but we learn to use it and to make pretty good estimations of where a person is looking at. So the way we learn gaze in an unsupervised way, it turns out, by the way, that in computer vision, it's again a difficult problem, but people can solve it, and there are systems that can estimate the direction of gaze, but they are trained on lots and lots of supervised data that people tell them in annotated images where the person is looking at, and they can learn direction of gaze in this supervised way. The problem here is to do it in an unsupervised way, and the way we did it is supplying an internal supervision signal, which is very close to the mover event. The simple notion is that when a person picks up an object, at the moment they are picking it up, they are looking at it. So once I have an object, I can move it around and I don't have to look at it. But if it's placed here and I want to pick it up, I typically look at it at the instant that I'm grabbing it. So for this reason, we verified it by some simple psychophysics in videos, and people are doing it very, very consistently. So the idea is that you, again, train from movies, and whenever you detect this initial grabbing event, sort of a hand or even a mover, getting in the initial touch with an object, you freeze this frame, you take it, and you draw a little arrow from the position of the face to the location of the detected mover event. You assume here, or we assume here, that you have some sort of face detection already built in. So we detect the face. We watch, as I said, movies, find the frames with a mover event happening, draw this yellow line, we draw the yellow arrow, we draw internally, and these are the images of the faces that are being associated with the direction of gaze during the learned gazing. We use the relatively low resolution images to mimic the resolution at a relatively early age. So the information we get here is primarily from the overall face orientation rather than what happens exactly in the eyes. But in principle, you can get the eyes information as well. The direction we are computing here, the mover, we assume, gives us at this stage only two-dimensional information, a location in the image. So we are drawing here, these are sort of two-dimensional arrows in the image plane. So we represent the face. We use a simple hog representation for the face that we grabbed. We associate the computed direction, and we store this pair of the face representation and the associated direction of gaze in some sort of a memory. And then when we see a new face we have never seen before, we just use a k-nearest neighbor. We find the neighbors in the database to the face that we are seeing and take the average of the retrieved direction of gaze. You can see the results here. These are training images with the extracted direction of gaze. These are novel images, and although there are some people shown in both this side and this side, the actual computation was always done on novel faces. So this is in a leave one out type of methodology. So the movies and the images that you use for people here were never shown during training. You see in red is the prediction of the model of the direction of gaze. In green is the estimation of two human subjects that were given these static images and were asked to draw what they perceive as the direction of gaze in these images. In looking at the cumulative error, how often you, what kind of errors you get in 700 images in this case, the two humans and the model perform very closely compared to some baseline sort of guess based on overall statistics that is used as a baseline here. So, yeah.
So when we follow gaze, we guess a 3D location where the person is looking. And it looks like here you are estimating just a 2D vector.
As I said, here it's just 2D vector, so you can follow it, you can follow it in the image, and in the image here you draw the two-dimensional vectors. In principle, we started with the 2D because it's simpler, and also because at the ages we are talking about, this gaze following started about 3 months of age, in which case, at that age, they have no three-dimensional estimation, very poor three-dimensional estimation at this stage. In principle, if you have some kind of a three-dimensional scene interpretation, and the mover is detected in 3D, you can recover a 3D vector, which you have not tried. So the modeling here is the input is the faces, and the output is in the image plane, you draw the two-dimensional vector, the angle theta of the direction of gaze in the image plane.
So a second question is, why do you focus on gaze when I can guess where you're looking even if I don't see your eyes? Supposedly you're looking at a screen, I know where you're looking, and I don't see your eyes. Why would you only look at the eyes?
But we are not, as I said, we do not, at this stage, we are not looking at the eyes at all. We are looking at the overall face, head configuration. I think I can show you later, people are very sensitive to the direction of the eyes in the, so with the same, if we get to the end, if I have 1 minute, I have a slide somewhere showing exactly the same face configuration, but the are slightly different, and you are very sensitive to this. So I think we as humans, adult humans, we estimate direction of gaze all the time, and we do it on the combination of both the normal to the face and the direction of the eyes in the orbit. So.
By gaze, you mean something like object or direction of attention, right? I mean, your ground truth is some people's subjective estimate, right?
Here is people.
And I mean that to be a good fit, right? Like it's not actually where the irises of the eyes are pointing, because you can't even.
No. It's,
but it's a cognitive concept.
Right. So what we want here with the direction of gaze is right, being able to say that he's now looking at this object. This is the direction.
So in principle, a machine could do better than a human in some way. If you could collect a ground truth data, but instruct the person who is being filmed to look at this specific spot.
Actually, we've tested our algorithms also. I mean, yes, but this is not a major point. Yes, what we've done, in fact, in some of our movies, which are not shown here, we placed some objects on the table and we labeled them with numbers, and we asked a person to grab object number 1 or number 9 and so on, and then we had also a ground truth of where the person was actually looking, and then we could compare not just against the ground truth of where other people are judging it, but we had some curves of ground truth against where the person was actually looking, at least where he was instructed to look. So the final task, as I said, is to look at a person like this and to know whether he's looking at this object or this object, looking over there, and so on. That's the, yeah. Okay, so I'll do this quickly, but you can see that you can start to get sort of meaningful thing that if we see an image like this, we know that these are the hands, we know that these are the direction of gaze, we know, I didn't talk about it, that these objects are manipulable objects that can be moved around and the babies are moving them. So we get the beginning of an interpretation that there are both agents here, there are both manipulating agents, and the one on the left is interested in the other one's objects. So this is a part of something that we'd like eventually to be able to do in a more complete way, to understand more about sort of these movers, tracking, various things that you want to put in the box, which helps you to deal with unsupervised learning of new concepts, things like the mover, tracking, the connection to the gaze, the co-training of different classifiers. This is sort of in the box before you start to collect specific data or specific objects, and it helps you to both recognize objects, but also, as I was trying to at least motivate in part, to learn about hands in appearance, by appearance and context, gaze, and later on even the direction of gaze, I mentioned this, so let me show you this slide, that it turns out that infants are sensitive when they learn language and new nouns and new verbs, they are sensitive to the direction of gaze and they use it to make inferences. So for example, if they see this image, and this is from a 2009 paper, that the person who is talking says he was mooping him, but once looking at the rabbit and once looking at the elephant, the inferences of what the babies take out from the word mooping depends on the direction of gaze, and it will change what they understand from the word mooping depending on whether what they see is the direction of gaze is to the left or to the right. Okay, just to summarize and to finish, I think that this internal supervision saves you or lets you deal with unsupervised data. It also helps you to deal with things which are not necessarily salient and clear and jump at you in the outside world, because they sort of can move you and guide you to things which are important but not necessarily salient. Gaze is not something very salient sort of objectively, but you get it. And you probably, most of you know about this very large-scale unsupervised learning by Andrew Ng a year ago, slightly more than a year ago, when they ran unsupervised learning using some sort of deep learning on 10 million images taken from 10 million YouTube images, and they discovered some salient structures, primarily faces, to a lesser degree cats, that's sort of the cat they discovered, and some body parts, but these were not very strong, and they were the most salient things in the video. In the video contained lots of cats, and they contained people and faces and so on, so they managed to get some things with difficulty, and the things which were objectively the most salient in the videos. But to get quickly things which are less statistically salient and significant in the images is very hard, and I think that the kind of mechanism I discussed are helpful to do this. I will not get into this. It's another, I just wanted to mention it in a very briefly, but time is out, so just let me mention it without showing even the slide to save time. We think that object segmentation, object segregation is another instance in which you have sort of an internal guiding mechanism which uses motion discontinuities in moving images in order to guide you to the acquisition of lots and lots of local boundary cues, which then allow you to do static segmentation, which is very difficult. So we think that it's another interesting case in which you have sort of built-in mechanisms to supply you with internal supervision that collects the correct data for you, gives them to the right machinery to interpret them and to construct segmentation algorithm out of them. So just as a summary slide, we've seen examples of complex concepts that people can acquire, and they are not exactly purely learned on their own from first principle alone, and they are not innate. They are built upon some domain-specific structure that you put in, but without putting in the full solution. So you do not have a system that is given to you with hand detectors, but you have a system with wired-in detection of interesting motion, different types of motion events, which will be used later to get hands, direction of gaze, and so on. So they provide internal supervision. It's also interesting, and I think it's a motif that we are seeing, that there are sort of built-in interesting learning trajectories, that one thing you learn gets you more easily to the other. Movers help you with hand with gaze with reference in language, and so on. So each one in turn, once it's mastered, can provide input to the next stage, and you get this kind of learning trajectories that get you into more and more complicated concepts, including concepts which are by themselves are not specifically salient in the input. Many of these instances and the specific examples and so on come from looking at cognition, at development, and so on. I think it's interesting to think about similar principles incorporated into computational systems. And let me stop here, and thank you. Thanks for Okay, at least the one point I can relate to specifically, you mentioned that maybe watching their own hands is better than watching the kind of cues that I supplied. Um, so as I said, we tried this and compared it to the best way we can. We think we have good evidence to show that it's not doing their own hands, and I think there are other pieces of data that suggest to it. They also do it, detecting hands and looking at hands starts before they start to manipulate objects. They start to look specifically at hands. So I think that their own manipulation of objects comes later, and I think that one has to explain how looking specifically at hands, which as I said, are really not easy objects to learn to recognize and to detect in images and follow them, how it comes so quickly prior to object manipulation, and as I said, probably independent of using their own hand. So if there is another way, then maybe, I think, yet to be discovered. But I find this quite plausible. And in fact, there are a number of groups now looking into this. It suggests certain things about which we have partial evidence already, but they are going to look more into it. For example, that the first hand images that babies can recognize are actually hands of other people, from the other people perspective of looking at other people, in the action of manipulating objects, as opposed to, for example, just hands moving in the air, waving and so on. So there are some specific predictions that come out of it that can be further tested. Julian.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to support the view because I think that there are also evidence that babies are, when they are born, they choose somehow to select the biological
We actually tried we tried to look at biological motion for hands. I think you're right, and I said at the beginning, I think that you learn a lot by manipulating objects. I do not try to underestimate or to say that your own experience with manipulating, moving in the world and manipulating objects does not enter into the learning. I said at the beginning, I'm interested primarily in the contribution of vision, which I think is very large. I think that the early recognition of hands and gaze, as I said, partly because of the age, that it's prior to manipulation, I think that there is a particularly large contribution of vision. But I think that the contribution of manipulation and action, moving, exploring are all important and all need to be taken into account. But I don't think that are the major force behind this particular thing.
On the other hand, it seems strange that the system is not using the fact that it can basically measure the position of its own hands by through perception and sources. In this respect, also maybe that just using only visual information for this kind of task is something. It's an extra complication of the system, while using knowledge about trajectories and velocity profile also be
No,
important.
I think, as I said, and I think we looked at it comes back to the issue of own hands, and I think that own hands are at some point used in order to learn your own hands. I think that it's an important concept, and I think that we know that in the monkey, for example, in the monkey representation of hands in area F5 and in other areas of the brain, both hands in general and the monkey's own hands are represented, but typically side by side in different sub-areas. One is representing hands in general, and then there is a sub-area which represents the monkey's own hand from their own perspective. So I think it's an important concept for them to guide their hands and to be able to deal with them. But I think that both are required, and the one that is acquired first seems to be the one of hands of other people. And there is a problem, they not generalize easily from one to the other, and that's something that we tried in their own hand. Recognizing well your own hand does not transfer very easily to other people's hand and vice versa. So it's probably, they both have to be learned by two different channels. And I think that the evidence is that the one that comes first is actually other people's hands, and then later on you start to wave your own hands and master this as well. So again, I think that it's there, it's plausible. I think that manipulation and so on are important, but vision is also extremely important. And we know that people who are born without hands, for example, they do not manipulate objects until very later stages. From what we know, and there are some studies on this, they do not have any particular difficulties with mastering the early concepts. So I think that there are more than one avenue or route of getting into certain concepts. Vision is not the only one, but vision certainly is a very important contributor, and lots of what you learn you get from vision. Not only, but lots of what you get through vision. Okay.
Perhaps it's the caretaker's hands and the cause and effect that stimulates the attention to hands. And that would certainly, babies are picked up all the time, and they're not picked, and that's usually a relief. So perhaps that's why their other hands are as important as their own.
It could be. We think that it's certainly the basic or certain general attention motivation when they are more likely to learn and when they are less likely to learn, are more likely to learn when they have somebody they are interacting with. But we don't think that the images of the hands, picking them, will be particularly useful. We were thinking about ways of trying to simulate, to get good imagery for that. We think it will be very difficult. And as I said, in the baby's webcam, when we see what babies are looking at, we have data. And the data is, in the slide that I said, in the context that they had, babies looking at people while people were manipulating objects. About 80% of the frames contained hands, and the hands were of the other people manipulating objects.
3 months old.
About 3 months, right? But this, yeah, I think that's about the right. Even it was 2 and 3 months old.
If they've got no depth perception.
Right, but these are the distances. Yeah, but these are real data at the distance of about 1.5 meters and so on, and they get them, and that's what you see in the movies. So I think it's safe to assume that you get enough frames at the age of 2 or 3 months in which you have lots of images of hands touching objects. I think that's a very reasonable thing to say.
We should probably
Yeah.
wrap up and take a break.
Okay, thank you.